Since the founding of the American Republic, many Americans assumed that the United States would extend its dominion to the Pacific Ocean and create a vast republic that would spread democracy across the North American continent. This had been the dream of Thomas Jefferson, that America would become an empire for liberty, expanding across the continent. Towards that end, Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the young nation. Americans explored and filtered into this vast region in the 25 years following the War of 1812. In 1840, expansion fever gripped the nation. Americans began to believe that God ordained their expansion westward and southward. The 1845 annexation of Texas, described as fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence. Americans immediately seized upon the phrase manifest destiny to express their belief that the destiny of the United States was to expand to the Pacific and to Mexico. This expansion was manifest or inevitable. Most Americans had practical reasons for moving west. Personal economic problems, such as the Panic of 1837, convinced many to make a fresh start in the West. There was an abundance of land in the West, and land ownership was an important step to prosperity. As farmers and miners moved west, merchants followed. The transportation revolution that had opened the opportunity for trade with Asia, as well as that had already been established with Europe. The increasing number of settlers moving west inevitably affected Native American communities. Most tribes tried to maintain strong cultural traditions, even if they had been forced to move from their native lands. Others had already begun to assimilate the advancing white culture. Still others fought to keep whites away from their home. White encroachment into the lands of the Sauk Indians in western Illinois and eastern Iowa in the 1830s encouraged Sauk chief Black Hawk to lead a rebellion against the U.S. The Black Hawk War started in Illinois and spread to the Wisconsin Territory. It ended in June 1832 when Illinois state militia members slaughtered 200 Sauk and Fox peoples. The Sauk and Fox tribes were then forcibly removed to areas west of the Mississippi River. As settlers moved west, small numbers of displaced Native Americans occasionally fought them. The U.S. government responded by calling a conference with a number of tribal leaders near Laramie, Wyoming. Tribes in attendance included the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and Crow. Along with U.S. representatives, these tribes swore to maintain good faith and friendship in all their mutual intercourse and to make an effective and lasting peace. This became known as the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. It provided various Native American nations control of the Central Plains, land east of the Rockies, north of the Arkansas River to Canada. The Native Americans promised not to attack white settlers, and the government promised to respect their borders. Increasing numbers of settlers, however, continuously violated North American hunting grounds, depleting herds of elk and buffalo. The U.S. government repeatedly violated the treaty as well, and eventually secured other treaties which required these tribes to abandon their lands and move to reservations. While the westward movement of American settlers was disastrous for Native Americans, it was also hazardous for the settlers and traders who made the journey. Thousands made the trip using old Native American trails as well as new routes. One of the busiest and most well-known avenues of trade was the Santa Fe Trail. It ran 780 miles from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico. For about the first 150 miles, wagons traveled alone to Council Grove, Kansas. Here they would mass together into groups of 100 or more to travel in bands out of fear of attacks by Kiowa and Comanche Indians. Travelers along this trail established the first American presence in Mexican territory. Also prominent was the Oregon Trail, which ran from Independence, Missouri to Portland, Oregon. This traced some of the same paths followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition decades earlier. By 1844, approximately 5,000 Americans had settled in Oregon. One group that migrated westward along the Oregon Trail consisted of the Mormons, a religious community that would play a major role in settling the West. Mormon history began in western New York in 1827. Joseph Smith and 5 associates established the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith and his followers decided to move west. They settled in Illinois in 1839, and within 5 years their community numbered over 20,000 people. The Mormon practice of polygamy angered many of their neighbors. Smith was jailed in 1844 for destroying a printing press that printed protest against the Mormons. An anti-Mormon mob broke into the prison and murdered Smith and his brother. Smith's successor, Brigham Young, decided to move the Mormons beyond the boundaries of the United States. They traveled west until they arrived at the edge of the Great Salt Lake in 1847. In the early 1840s, Great Britain still claimed areas and parts of what are now Maine, Minnesota, and Oregon. A treaty in 1842 settled the boundary disputes in Maine and Minnesota, but the U.S. and Britain continued to hold a joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. In 1844, Democrat James K. Polk, a North Carolinian, ran for president on a platform that called for annexing the entire Oregon Territory. There was widespread support for Polk's idea, and the slogan 5440 or Fight was adopted. The slogan referred to the 54-degree 40-minute north latitude as the northern limit of the disputed Oregon Territory. By the 1840s, Britain had lost interest in Oregon. Polk's advisors informed him that the land north of the 49th parallel was unsuited for farming. Consequently, in 1846, the two sides agreed to extend the mainland boundary with Canada along the 49th parallel westward from the Rockies to Puget Sound. This established the current U.S. border to the north. Unfortunately, establishing the southern boundary would not be so easy, but now the way was open for the United States to realize its manifest destiny from the east to the west coast.